Pursuant to House Resolution 315 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 1582. Will the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Yoder, kindly take the chair?
In the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 1582, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to protect consumers by prohibiting the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency from promulgating as final certain energy-related rules that are estimated to cost more than $1 billion and will cause significant adverse effects to the economy.
When the Committee of the Whole House rose on Wednesday, July 31st, 2013, a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174, offered by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, had been postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-174, offered by Mr. Woodall of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume to talk about an amendment that recognizes that knowledge is power. So often today we've talked about what we can do to make the government more accountable to the people. Well, one of those things is entailed in the underlying bill that says for these big rules that make a big difference, tell us what it is that you did. How did you come to this decision that this is the rule that you want to implement? My amendment goes one step further and asks for the underlying data on which that decision was made. We want to know what those calculations were. It's going to be a good step forward if we can get agencies to share with us their modeling. But one step further would be those calculations that went into the modeling and came out of the modeling. What about the underlying data, Mr. Speaker? How in the world can we be in a conversation as the American people, as the Congress, with the agencies if we don't have access to the underlying data? Again, this is not a trade secret. This is not private information. This is the information that the agency uses to promulgate these rules that will then govern the entire United States of America. We simply say, if the disclosure of that data won't violate any laws, if it won't violate any trade secrets, if it's not going to be in violation of any applicable federal laws, share that with America. Post that on your web page so that anyone who is interested in understanding how it is that these decisions that often go on behind closed doors, that often go on without the oversight of the public, not just what did you decide, but how did you decide it? It's very difficult, whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, to hold the considered experts at these agencies accountable if you can't see the underlying data that went into their calculations. Simple amendment that says, please share that with us. We're not questioning your expertise. We simply want to be a part of that process. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition, seek the time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I rise in opposition to this amendment. The supporters would claim that it's about transparency, but what it's really about is not transparency. It's about a way to block or delay critical EPA rules. That's what this whole bill is all about, and the amendment does the same thing. They use a rhetoric about transparency to cloud the amendment's true impact. The amendment would prevent EPA from using the best science available when implementing its public health laws. It accomplishes this by not allowing EPA to rely on any scientific study unless the agency can publish on its website all of the underlying data associated with that study. Well, today EPA prides itself on using the best science available The agency understands that ideology will not stand the test of time, but science will. And their rules have to be, and regulations have to be, based on the science. So they gladly inform stakeholders and the public about the studies upon which they rely. But the underlying data to peer-reviewed studies is often not published. That's because the data sets underlying peer-reviewed scientific studies are the property of the scientists that spend their careers gathering that information. EPA cannot require the scientists to give up their private information. Oftentimes, those studies involve going to a lot of people and trying to find out the impact of certain exposure to pollutants. Those people agree to study on the basis that this information about them will not be made public. But this amendment would say it would be impossible for EPA to use gold standard scientific studies available to them unless they post this other data on their website. Why do we want to prevent EPA from using high-quality scientific studies to set new pollution standards? This is an issue that came up many years ago. In 1997, EPA used a study conducted by researchers at Harvard to set a new air quality standard for particulate matter. They did a rigorous peer-reviewed study that was conducted over a period of 16 years. And the Harvard people showed conclusively that exposure to particulate matter in the air can kill people. Well, polluters said, well, we don't want EPA to issue this rule. It's going to cost us money. So they said that the EPA should publish all of the Harvard scientists' data, claiming that the scientists were keeping a secret. Well, the data is the work product and property of the Harvard scientists, not EPA. The agency couldn't release that information. They're relying on the Harvard scientists to give independent scientists access to the data after the scientists signed a confidentiality agreement. So independent scientists spent the next 3 years reanalyzing the data and came to exactly the same conclusion. There should be no objection to EPA relying on studies like this one. It's a long-term study with a huge sample. This is exactly the kind of rigorous review we expect of EPA. I urge opposition to this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself 15 seconds
to
say nothing could be further from the truth. There's a specific provision in this amendment that says you shall not disclose anything for which the disclosure would violate your commitments under federal law. All we're asking for is whatever EPA saw, whatever the agency saw to make their decision, if it was good enough for the agency, shouldn't it be good enough for Congress as well? With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot understand why somebody would object to this. The bill is about transparency, and this amplifies that transparency. EPA can impose rules which cost tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars on the U.S. economy. Those expenses translates into job loss. Having access to the underlying information and the estimates of costs and benefits is critical to know why that is. And as regards, as my colleague said, there is no reason to have to reveal information about individuals. But let me just point out to the medical literature. In the medical literature, there is a push that if the federal government funds research, that underlying data is made available to the general public. When the FDA reviews drugs, FDA will look at underlying data. So why would we require it for medications, which obviously affect many people, but not for the EPA? Having methodology which is transparent is absolutely essential in modern medical, modern scientific literature. I don't see why there is an objection to it, unless the hope is that EPA can satisfy an ideological bent without having to justify it. This amendment will provide more transparency for EPA's billion-dollar rules. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment and yes on the underlying bill the American people cannot afford to have jobs shipped overseas or have their economy otherwise wrecked. More rationality, transparency, and accountability must be brought to the EPA and its rule-making process. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the fact of the matter is that EPA does not have this underlying data. It doesn't belong to EPA. It belongs to the scientists who did the study. Consider this issue in a different context. If a pharmaceutical manufacturer wants to bring a new product to market, they would never be required to post all of their underlying data on the public website in order for FDA to rely on it. There's no other agency that would be held to such an unreasonable requirement as this amendment would impose on EPA. They review the data, but they don't put it on their website. EPA does not have the underlying data, and they can't require that the owners of the underlying data who did the study, often based on confidential agreements for those who participate in the study, they can't require that study be given to them. They are relying on the scientific data and the study results, and I think that all this would do is make it more difficult for EPA to protect the public health. Yield back to balance.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Can I ask the Chair how much time remains?
1 1/4 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume to say I think I speak for most of America that says I understand the government has to make decisions, but since the government is making those decisions on my behalf, shouldn't the government share with me the data that it uses to make those decisions? The gentleman says this is going to hold EPA to a higher standard than the other agencies. I would say to the gentleman, you can look forward to me being back with this same amendment for absolutely every agency. All we're saying is, if you've seen the data, if you've utilized the data, if you believe this is sound enough science on which to base a regulation that is going to cost not $1, not $100, not $1,000, not $1 million, but more than $1 billion, isn't it worth sharing with the American people how you reach that conclusion? Mr. Chairman, the work that we do here, we should be proud enough of to share with absolutely anyone who asks. This is about transparency, and even if you don't support the underlying bill, I'm a strong supporter, but even if you don't, you should support, in the context of transparency, providing the underlying materials to the American public that went into this decision-making process. Mr. Chairman, this is a great step forward as a transparency tool for the American public to restore that faith in government that has been lost. I rise in strong support of the underlying bill and ask my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The chair understands that amendment number 5 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment made in order.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize myself for 2 minutes. I have an amendment in an order that would prohibit the EPA from using the social cost of carbon estimates for an energy-related rule that costs more than $1 billion unless and until a federal law is enacting authorizing such use. Now, the administration slipped into a rule about microwave ovens, a new prediction for the cost of carbon dioxide emissions between now and the year 2300. Despite the profound implications to economy and families who make a living from coal, there was no public debate, no stakeholder comment, no vote in Congress on this new estimate. In southwestern Pennsylvania, coal is our heritage. It fires the steel mills that build the Empire State Building, the St. Louis Arch, the Golden Gate Bridge, but that heritage and prosperity is threatened by this new regulation. We've already seen what the social cost of the war on coal is today. The cost is jobs. 3 weeks ago, more than 380 workers at the Hatfields Ferry and Mitchell power plants in Pennsylvania were told they were losing their jobs. The plants had to shut down under EPA regulations after they spent hundreds of millions of dollars in new environmental modernizations. More than 15 organizations representing workers and stakeholders endorsed my amendment because these groups share my concern that this regulation that bypassed congressional oversight will put hundreds of thousands of miners, boilermakers, factory workers, laborers, railroaders, electricians, operating engineers, steam fitters, and machinists out of work. My amendment says Congress, not the EPA, decides regulations by considering what this means to the families and workers. The EPA's policies have real-world consequences. Annual coal production in Central Appalachia is dropping sharply by more than half in just 5 years' time. There are towns where mines are shutting down, where a staggering 41% of the residents fall below the poverty line. The social cost of carbon and the wider war on coal is a war on the American worker and their family. Let me show you the real cost of the EPA's rules. Those who oppose this amendment ignore the health effects of those living in poverty who are twice likely to have a risk of depression, asthma, obesity, diabetes, heart attacks, and other health effects. Poverty leads to devastated communities, early death, the lost dreams of a generation of Americans and their children. And many of us can remember Bobby Kennedy's walk through those broken Appalachian coal towns back in the 1960s to illustrate the abject poverty where families and children were living. I worked and volunteered in those towns, trying to help families hang on to some sort of semblance of hope in a hard-scrabble life. I yield myself additional time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Too often their hope failed, and now history is about to repeat itself. First, jobs are lost for the tens of thousands, and after that, the hundreds of thousands. And when people lose their jobs, we give them unemployment compensation. They go hungry, we give them food stamps. They lose unemployment, we give them welfare. They lose their homes, we give them public housing. They lose their dignity and pride, and the government has nothing left to give. Nothing. When all these folks ever wanted was a job and a chance for the American dream, not shattered by the EPA. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. For what purposes? Gentleman from California rise.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment and seek time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The Murphy Amendment denies that carbon pollution is harmful. It prohibits the Environmental Protection Agency from considering the costs of climate change when analyzing the impacts of its rules. According to this amendment, the cost of carbon pollution is zero. Well, that's science denial at its worst. We are telling EPA the cost of carbon pollution is zero. It's like waving a magic wand. We are going to decree that climate change imposes no cost at all. Now, House Republicans can vote for this amendment. They can try to block EPA from recognizing the damage caused by climate change, but they cannot overturn the laws of nature. We should be heeding the warnings of the world's leading climate scientists, not denying reality. In the real world, scientific instruments accurately measure the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the levels trapped in ancient ice. Those measurements tell us that carbon dioxide levels just hit 400 parts per million this spring. And that's the highest levels in the last 3 million years. In the real world, higher levels of heat-trapping carbon pollution are warming the planet and changing the climate. We're experiencing more record-breaking temperatures, worse droughts, longer wildfire seasons, with more intense wildfires, an increased number of intense storms, more flooding, and rapidly rising sea levels. Pretend it doesn't happen. Pretend that there's not the reality. On the other hand, as the proponent of the members of this amendment suggested, let's look at the impact on a family that may lose its job. Well, I think that ought to be under consideration, but that's not an amendment that would ignore the cost of carbon pollution. We are seeing the effect of climate change, not sometime in the future, but right now. And we're being told it's not going to get better by itself, it's going to get worse. Scientists have been telling us for years. EPA and other federal agencies have a responsibility to calculate the cost of climate change and take them into account when they issue new standards. That's common sense. And that was the clear message from the Government Accountability Office when it added climate change to its high-risk list earlier this year. And that's exactly what the Obama administration is doing. They have an interagency task force that worked over the course of several years to estimate the cost of the harm from carbon pollution. It incorporated the latest scientific and technical information. I'm sorry if people lose their jobs, but they don't have to lose their jobs. If an industry is told to reduce carbon emissions, they don't have to fire people. They can develop and buy the technology that would reduce that pollution. So to help those polluters not have to do that, we're going to pretend there's no cost. Mr. Murphy's amendment would require the government to assume zero harm, zero cost from carbon pollution and climate change. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. It's based on magical thinking. Don't be a science denier. Vote against the amendment, and I reserve whatever time I have left.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do we have left on our side?
You have 2.5 minutes. The gentleman from California has 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from West Virginia, the number 2 coal-producing state in America.
Gentlelady from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in strong support of my colleague Mr. Murphy's amendment and its opposition to the EPA's arbitrary backdoor approach to regulating carbon dioxide emissions. These regulations would and are having a catastrophic effect on jobs and economic activity across the country, especially in our coal-producing states such as West Virginia and Pennsylvania. The administration's new social cost of carbon calculation is nothing more than a gimmick used to circumvent Congress so that job-killing regulations and an anti-domestic energy agenda can move forward. Perhaps to no one's surprise, just as the administration is stepping up its effort to issue regulations aimed at closing existing plants and stopping new ones, it decided, without public comment or transparency, to increase the cost of carbon by 44%. The fact is, U.S. carbon emissions from the energy sector have fallen in the last 4 of 5 years. I am not willing to sacrifice West Virginia jobs to the administration's ideological efforts. I ask my colleagues to put jobs ahead of politics and pass the Murphy Amendment.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we have how much time left on our side?
1.5 minutes.
Thank you. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I would ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
I rise in strong support of the Murphy Amendment, and I also want to say we should vote for that in conjunction with the gentleman from Georgia's amendment that was just heard previously. If you walk into a greenhouse anywhere in America, do you know what the average carbon concentration will be? It won't be 350 parts per million. It won't be 400 parts per million. It'll be over 1,000 parts per million. We have records that indicate the CO2 concentration in the upper atmosphere has been as high as 5,000 to 6,000 parts per million in the past. The gentleman from California and those adherents of his philosophy would have you believe that having a carbon concentration between 350 and 400 parts per million is somehow cataclysmic. Nothing could be further from the truth. And this new cost of carbon calculation that the EPA and the DOE have begun to include needs to be, at a minimum, made transparent. And I think it's fine until we have the facts that it shouldn't be allowed at all. So vote for the Murphy Amendment.
Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, this is not my philosophy that would lead me to urge that we reduce carbon emissions. It's based on the science. Thousands of peer-reviewed scientific studies have indicated that carbon causes problems. It causes health effects, and it threatens the climate. The homeowners in Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and California who have seen their homes ravaged by drought-stoked wildfires know the cost of carbon pollution. The families of brave firefighters knew the cost of carbon pollution. The farmers and ranchers suffering the effects of prolonged drought, many of whom have lost entire crops or been forced to sell their livestock, know the cost of carbon pollution. And the thousands who lost businesses and homes after Hurricane Sandy slammed into the East Coast knew the cost of carbon pollution. That cost is not based on a philosophy. It's based on the science and the reality. Reject this magical thinking amendment. Don't be a science denier. Vote against the amendment and the underlying
Gentleman's
bill.
time's expired. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this isn't about denying science. This is about denying jobs and denying opportunity. The underlying amendment here is supported by the Boilermakers, the electrical workers, the operating engineers, the carpenters, and United Mine Workers, the American Energy Alliance, National Mining Association, National Taxpayers Union, and Chamber of Commerce, because they want jobs and they don't want poverty. And poverty, Mr. Chairman, is the #1 threat to the environment. Poverty is the #1 threat to public health. And it's time Congress took charge of regulations and not unregulated divisions of the government. Mr. Chairman, I ask members to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from California.
I request a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I move that the committee now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 1582, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereof.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 1582 and has come to no resolution thereon. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in a recess for a period of less than 15 minutes. House will be in order. Pursuant to House Resolution 315 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 1582. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, will kindly resume the chair.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 1582, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to protect consumers by prohibiting the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency from promulgating as final certain energy-related rules that are estimated to cost more than $1 billion and will cause significant adverse effects to the economy.
When the Committee of the Whole House rose earlier today, a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174, offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, had been postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part B of House Report 113-174, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Mr. Waxman of California. Amendment number 3 by Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Amendment number 6 by Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. The Chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174 by the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 183 to 228.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
On this vote, the yeas are 183 and the nays are 230. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174 by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. This vote, the yeas are 182 and the nays are 224. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174 by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 234, the nays are 178. The amendment is adopted. The question is on the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Accordingly, under the rules of the committee, under the rule, the committee rises. Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union has under consideration H.R. 1582. Pursuant to House Resolution 315, I report the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has under consideration the bill H.R. 1582, and pursuant to House Resolution 315, reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered, and it is a separate vote demanded on any amendment to the amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole. If not, the question is on the adoption of the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute as amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes seem to have it. Third reading.
A bill to protect consumers by prohibiting the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency from promulgating as final certain energy-related rules that are estimated to cost more than $1 billion and will cause significant adverse effects to the economy.
The House will come to order. The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentlewoman opposed to the bill?
Yes, I'm opposed.
The gentlewoman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. Capps of California moves to recommit the bill.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I reserve a point of order against the motion to recommit.
Points of order are reserved. Clerk will report.
Ms. Capps of California moves to recommit the bill H.R. 1582 to the Committee on Energy and Commerce with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. At the end, add the following section, Section 5, protecting the health of children and seniors. This act shall not apply with respect to rules that will result in reduced incidence of cancer, premature mortality, asthma attacks, or respiratory disease in children or seniors.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 5 minutes. Thereafter, an opponent. The House will come to order. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer the final amendment to the bill. And I want to be clear, passage of this amendment will not prevent passage of the underlying bill. If it's adopted, my amendment will be incorporated into the bill and the bill will immediately be voted upon. As currently written, H.R. 1582 would cripple the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to protect the water we drink and the air we breathe. My amendment simply ensures that the EPA can continue to protect children and seniors from the harmful impacts of pollution. My friends across the aisle claim this bill is about transparency, but let's call it what it is. Just another attempt to block the EPA from doing its job. This bill makes no sense on so many levels. It's redundant and it's unnecessary. It gives the Energy Secretary unprecedented authority to veto EPA rules, and it allows for indefinite delays of EPA rulemaking. Our top priority should be the health of our children and of our families, not the bottom line of polluting energy companies. It's scary to think how many EPA protections.
Gentlelady, suspend. The House will please come to order. Gentlewoman is recognized.
It's frightening to think how many EPA protections that we now take for granted would have been delayed or derailed if this bill were law. Consider the recently finalized mercury and air toxic standards. Before these rules, there were no federal standards limiting power plant emissions of toxic pollutants like mercury and arsenic. As we know, these toxic pollutants are really poisons. They cause a variety of serious health problems in people of all ages. They affect brain development in children. They can cause serious birth defects when pregnant women are exposed. That's why EPA put restrictions on these toxic emissions, restrictions that protect future generations and set them up for success, while also reducing preventable health care costs. If H.R. 1582 had been law, these rules could have been delayed indefinitely or not happened at all. Mr. Speaker, my friends across the aisle talk frequently about the financial costs of these and other EPA actions.
Will the House come to order? Gentlelady from California.
But what about the health care costs? Costs that all of us pay when these preventable ailments occur. And what about the human costs of inaction? Delaying the air toxic standards for just one additional year would have resulted in more than 11,000 heart attacks, more than 120,000 asthma attacks, more than 12,000 more hospital and emergency room visits, and up to 25,300 lives lost due to smog, due to soot, due to toxic air pollution. And that's just in 1 year. Mr. Speaker, people should be more important than profit. My amendment speaks to just this. It would simply shield the rules that protect the health of children and of seniors from this dangerous bill. If my colleagues are serious about protecting our children and our seniors, they should have no trouble supporting this amendment. More than anyone, children and seniors rely on the EPA to do its job protecting public health and the environment. The mercury and air toxics rules and others like it are helping children and families across the nation live healthier, longer lives. Perhaps polluters find these rules inconvenient, but the American people certainly don't. They want clean air to breathe. They want clean water to drink. And they want the peace of mind that comes from strong public health standards. My amendment ensures that protecting the health of our children and seniors never takes a backseat to the financial interests of our polluters. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and make sure that the health and well-being of our children and seniors always comes first. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I claim the time in opposition to the motion. I withdraw my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, this bill doesn't cripple anything. Laws that are currently on the book stay on the book. The problem is the EPA uses bad science. I say that not as a Republican. I say that as quoting other scientists. For example, a gentleman who is a former member of the Harvard School of Public Health testified that EPA's statistical approach is fraught with numerous assumptions and uncertainty. A physician from the Colorado School of Public Health said that the way that EPA uses statistics is highly misleading to public policymakers. I will make the point. You cannot be pro-family unless you're pro-environment, and you cannot be pro-environment unless you're pro-family, but you can't be either unless you first have a strong and healthy economy. Now, the Energy Consumers Relief Act simply puts a check on the billion-dollar energy rules that may hurt American families, costing American jobs. If you support transparency and good government, you should support this bill. If you support protecting American families and consumers from higher energy costs, you should support H.R. 1582. If you support having the prosperity needed for families, for environmental and health protections, you should support 1582. If you're pro-jobs, pro-economic growth, and anti-poverty, you should support H.R. 5082. I urge you to vote no on this motion to recommit. I urge you to support the Energy Consumers Relief Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman from California is recognized. A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 5-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5 minutes votes on the passage of H.R. 1582, if ordered, ordering the previous question on House Resolution 322, adoption of House Resolution 322, if ordered, and the motion to suspend the rules on H.R. 1897. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 188, the nays are 221. The motion is not adopted. The question is on the passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes seem to... Gentleman from California.
On that vote, I demand a roll call.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote. On this bill, the yeas are 232. All right, that's it. After that, I'm not doing it. On this bill, the yeas are 232, the nays are 181. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.